morning. Welcome to Struggles of the Spirit. I'm your host, the Reverend Leland Udell. We're addressing these days the whole question about the nature of a person's ministry, whether they are a lay person or an ordained person, whether they're a rabbi, no matter what kind of life that they're living. How do they get into that kind of interest of ministry, and what are some of the threads that came together to form the fabric of their ministry, and how has their ministry changed over the years? I'm sort of sponsoring this particular theme because it's my belief that a lot of us human beings have a ministry. Sometimes we don't realize it, we don't verbalize it, we don't conceptualize it, but that we do have a ministry. And it's a Christian term sometimes, but I think in the broadest sense of the word, it can go beyond that of the Christian. So today we have Father Frank Connors, who is a chaplain at the Fletcher Allen Health Care here in Burlington, Vermont. He's a longtime friend and colleague, and delighted, Frank, to have you here today to talk about that.
Thank you.
What I'd like you to begin to look at is how did you realize that ministry was something that you were interested in, rather than the restaurant business or being a CPA and in business, or how did
well, actually, funny that you mentioned CPA, because I did indeed train in accounting right after high school.
I remembered.
But actually, my vocation, I think, goes back long before that. I think all the way through grammar school, I sort of had the priesthood either in the front of my mind or the back of my mind. It was something that appealed to me, you know, varying degrees at varying times, but I think it was always there. In high school, things kind of, you know, you got interested in other things. I was always interested in numbers and math, so accounting became kind of interesting to me. But also a couple of things happened along through high school. I had a little difficulty in high school with a priest principal of a high school, which resulted in me changing schools. So I did my last 2 years in a public school, and I think that kind of put the hold on my vocation for a little while.
Gave you a different experience, though.
Yes, but even going back before that, you know, I think the whole idea of how parents nurtured things, and in my case it was probably different than a lot of cases. My mother was a convert, and it was she who really nurtured my vocation. My father was not too much of a churchgoer, and my mother came to Brattleboro, which was my hometown, to do nurses training. She came from the East Barry area, and she and another nurse in training in Brattleboro both started taking instructions in the Catholic faith, because they were both going with Catholic men, unbeknown to either of the men that they were taking instructions.
Wow. So
she was the one who nurtured my vocation, I think, probably. And
she was very conscientious.
Yes, she very much was.
Did she see her nursing as ministry, would you say?
I think she did. She didn't nurse all that long because she was not a very healthy person. In fact, being in the medical field a little bit now kind of is more related to her than being in ministry, I think, because she was a nurse, and my only sister is a nurse, and she now has a son who is a nurse. So nursing seems to run in the family, so probably not strange that I ended up in hospital chaplaincy, although that came out of the blue to me, but it's still probably not strange. But
I'm trying to put words in your mouth, but please don't accept them if it's not true. So you would see nursing as, for many people, as a form of ministry.
I think so, yes.
Okay.
As I say, my mother didn't nurse very long because of her health, but my sister's been at the same nursing home for about 25 or 30 years now. She's been evening supervisor for forever there, and you know, she just sees her work with the elderly people as something that she really sees as more than a job. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, that's very good in that field to take it that way. And so I think, you know, that whole complex of being from a family of nurses and nurses who saw their work as ministry. I think my father probably saw his work as ministry too. You might find that strange, seeing he was in the coal business, but he was what you might call a funny businessman way back before environmental issues and things like that. I remember riding the truck with him summers, and he would be telling people in the 1950s to get good storm windows. Mm-hmm. Most coal dealers in 1950 weren't telling people that, I don't think. Once they had to become environmentalists, they might have started telling people that, but I don't think in the 1950s too many people selling fuel were telling people to get storm windows.
Oh, burn up more. Leave the windows open.
So I think, you know, he probably saw his life as dealing with people in a real way, which in a way is ministry.
I think so. Do you want to define what that word might mean? For you, anyway?
Well, it's developed much over the years, I think. I think I saw it much as a young child as the celebrator in church. Being
on the altar.
I would, you know, run around the house with a towel tied around my neck to make a vestment and things like that. Mm-hmm. And of course I was an altar boy from second grade on and serving Mass from 4th grade on, so I was quite conversant around the sanctuary and enjoyed it. In fact, I remember many days in high school when we rather rushed things a little bit. We had 2 priests in our parish, but the pastor was really retired. He was an elderly priest, but in those days we left priests in their position in the parish. So the only other priest in the parish was both the assistant priest and the principal of the school. And many days in high school I've had him for a first period French class, went to church with him to celebrate a second period funeral, to the cemetery for a burial during the 3rd period, and back to school for a 4th period French class that he taught. So I saw that the priesthood was very busy, even though in those days there were a lot more priests than there are today.
And the priests did a variety of things, too.
Right, and still do, yeah. And so I think that began to appeal to me, that there was a lot of service to people involved in the priesthood. And then, as I say, during the high school years, because of some difficulties, I changed schools, so I think that kind of delayed my, and too, the developing interest in accounting. And I'm already into accounting, because my father by that time had merged with a larger company, and the office manager of the larger company had been a Bentley graduate and introduced me to Bentley, where I went. So, you know, I kind of had an in to a field that I was interested in. So, and I very much liked accounting. In fact, my plan when I finished accounting was to go on in accounting, but at that time, of course, the first question you got asked anywhere you went for a job was, what were your marks? And the second question you were asked was, what was your draft status?
Oh, yes.
So I decided to change my draft status. So I went in the Navy and was in the Navy in supply for 4 years. And I worked a lot with chaplains in the Navy. Unofficially, I was never officially assigned to a chaplain, but I worked with various chaplains in different capacities, either singing in the choir or being an usher, or I was actually one secretary for a little while, even though I was still doing my regular job. So,
and as I remember, you were overseas in the Philippines, was it?
No, that was vacation. I was in the Philippines. I was in New Zealand.
New Zealand.
When I was in the Navy, I was Operation Deep Freeze, which was the Antarctic expedition, and actually we didn't have a chaplain in New Zealand. We went to the local the local Catholic church. But in every other place I was, I got to know chaplains very well, and as I said, did various things with them, including one Christmas in California. We went way up some canyon, I can't remember the name of it now, to a correctional facility where we celebrated Christmas Mass on a bar in a bar room for a bunch of young detainees. And that was quite an experience.
I bet you've never been at an altar like that.
No, I haven't celebrated on a bar again. No, that's the only time I've celebrated on a bar. In fact, I did. Well, of course, I wasn't the celebrant then.
No,
but,
no.
I was about everything else. I was the altar boy. I was the choir. I was the usher. So I was quite involved in that experience.
Were you in any kind of military action when you were in the Navy? Or?
Not hostile action, no. I was in during the beginning times of Vietnam when we were there but weren't there. But we knew we were there because we had the same types of cargo airplanes that were flying in and out of Vietnam, so we were shipping parts to them, but we were there just as advisors.
I asked the questions. I wondered if your military experience had strengthened your interest in...
Well, as I say, it was during that time that things began to come back into focus, and I began talking with various chaplains, and through talking with the chaplains, I decided to get in touch with my parish priest back home when I was home on liberty one weekend. I was my last few months in the Navy. I was stationed at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, so I wasn't far from home, so I got home a lot of weekends. So I just got in touch with my pastor and told him I was interested, and he started the process of getting in touch with the officials in Burlington that had to be let known, in the process of beginning to make arrangements to go to the seminary. So actually I came out of the Navy on August 16th, and I was in the seminary the second week of September.
Wow, you were well organized.
So it wasn't much of a hiatus.
No, you didn't go off on a vacation for 6 months. So
I had a quite varied seminary experience. My first 3 years were at a small seminary, St. John Vianney in Barre, Vermont, which no longer exists. It was in existence for 15 or 20 years. And that was really 2 years of college, but in those days you still had to study a significant amount of Latin, and I hadn't had enough in high school, so I had to do a year of Latin studies before I went into the college studies.
This is pre-Vatican II still.
Well, it was post-Vatican II, but immediately post-Vatican II. Vatican II happened while I was in the Navy. So in fact, Vatican II ended just about the time I got out of the Navy, but things hadn't taken hold yet. So, in fact, a lot of things in the church are still done in Latin, but all seminaries don't have as much Latin as they used to. In fact, I had one Latin class my sophomore year of college. We had to speak Latin in the classroom.
Oh my!
So, there was still some good teachers around in those days. I don't think they do that very many places.
Probably not.
But that particular seminary, I was one of the older students, of course, because I was 6 years out of high school and just beginning. And then I went to St. John's in Boston, the Archdiocesan Seminary, to finish my philosophy degree. And just as I was finishing my philosophy degree, we had a new vocations director appointed in the diocese. He was a much older man, and he had been head of the French department at La Salle University before he went to study for the priesthood. And he went to the Beta, which is a British college in Rome for older vocations. And he came back suggesting that I go there, and maybe their program would save me a year. However, in between in between Barre and Boston, I went with the Benedictines for a year in Weston, Vermont.
Oh, well, a lot of our viewers may know about Weston Priory. It's sort of a Vermont institution, I think.
Yes.
Do you want to reflect at all?
Well,
about
I went
time?
there specifically because I wasn't too happy with my development of the prayer life in the seminary, and of course, seeing it was immediate post-Vatican II, the emphasis was still on a lot of rote prayers and time spent in chapel and things like that. So I was really looking for a deeper prayer life. But very soon after I got there, I realized that I really wanted an active ministry, but I wanted to stay there a little while to kind of soak up this prayer life.
You weren't thinking of becoming a brother or a priest there?
Yeah, I mean, I went with that intention.
Oh, okay.
But
okay.
Very soon after there, I realized that I really wanted an active ministry, but I stayed a number of months, 7 or 8 or 9, just to get the basis in the prayer life, and then went on to Boston and then to Rome. And of course, in Rome, I was one of the younger students in the class. The average age of my ordination class was 41 or 42, and I was 32 when I was ordained, and 33 a couple weeks later.
Well, that was a very, must have been a very, how do I put it, stretching for you.
Well, it
varied experiences.
It was in a number of different ways. First of all, I was in a foreign country where I didn't speak the language, but the teaching language was English because it was a British college. In fact, it had been set up in Rome originally toward the end of the penal days in England, when you couldn't have Catholic seminaries in England. It was set up because there was a lot of Anglican clergymen becoming Roman Catholic clergymen at that time, and it was set up specifically for that purpose. Then it kind of mutated into being for any convert, whether they were a clergyman or not, who wanted to become a Roman Catholic priest. Then it sort of mutated again into being for older vocations. So it kind of followed history as to what its purpose was. But a tremendous cross-section of men there, all the way from, street sweepers and train drivers to doctors and lawyers. Never went to a doctor in Italy. All the 3 years I was there, we had English doctors in the house. There was one who was in his last year when I arrived, and he left, and the next year another one came and was there the rest of the time I was there. So, for things like colds and sore throats and things, you had a doctor in the house.
They would take a look at you.
Yeah. So, very much a cross-section. In fact, a couple of spies.
Spies? What do you mean?
Well, a U.S. Air Force major and a U.S. Army captain who had been in intelligence. And
I see.
An Australian who actually was a 007 agent in World War II and Korea. He was a man in his 60s at the time he was studying to be a priest. And so a tremendous cross-section of people. And a few people whose first language wasn't English, but they spoke English, so they came there for classes, like some monks, Benedictine monks from St. Paul's outside the walls, which was just across the street from our seminary. In fact, we didn't call it St. Paul's outside the walls, we called it St. Paul's across the street. one of the 4 major basilicas of Rome, St. Paul's across the street.
Can you conceptualize how this rich and varied educational experience in Rome, how did that color your ministry?
It turned out very well for me in the end. The Beta, for some years, had been known as kind of an easy place to go and be a priest, because the English bishops always had the idea that they took your past experience for what you were and gave you what theology you could learn. But with Vatican II, they were trying to upgrade studies a little bit, and they came upon the method of paper writing, a 12, 15, 18-page paper. And most of the courses were done that way. You'd have all the professors got together, so you didn't have 5 papers going at the same time, but they knew how many they wanted in theology every year, how many in scripture, how many in canon law. So they all portioned them out that way. And being a place with just 84 students living in and a few from religious orders coming in for studies, they knew everybody fairly well. So they really marked the man as well as marking the topic on the paper. They would expect more from me coming in with a philosophy degree from a seminary than they would from somebody who was a street sweeper.
I would think.
So in fact, it turned out to be a very good experience for me, because, as I said, the director of vocations, who had just come back and been appointed to that position, suggested I go there to save a year, because their program had been 1 year of philosophy and 3 of theology. But as I arrived, they had just integrated the program as Vatican II was suggesting, and they were teaching theology all 4 years and philosophy mixed in the first 2 years. And very hard time working out schedules. In fact, the rector told myself, and we had two teachers from England, one brother and one lay person. And of course, teachers from England tend to have degrees up one arm and down the other arm. So the three of us were in the position of, we already had philosophy degrees, so we didn't need to do philosophy yet. The schedule said that's the only way we fit into the slots. So finally, after about 2 weeks, the Dean of Studies worked it out for us, and he was the sophomore theology professor also. So he worked it out with the freshman theology professor that he would do his courses with us, the freshman teacher would do his courses with us as reading courses. And we would not go to philosophy classes, we'd have that time for the reading. So then the three of us and the freshman prof got together after we wrote our papers, and he selected one paper, and we did, you know, just like a defense of a degree paper. Of course, it wasn't a degree paper that we presented. It was a 12 or 15-page paper, but he conducted it in the same line as defending your paper as a degree. So that was a very good experience, and in that I picked up, being in a house of older Englishmen, I didn't have too much difficulty being the resident liberal, if not the resident radical. And I picked up the little tool of putting a quasi-heresy in a paper to give something to discuss on. And the first year prof seemed to like that fairly well, so then I started doing it for the second year prof too, because he conducted his whole class on that basis. Every paper that was turned in by 15 students, he'd pick one paper to be presented and defended. So I started doing that, and then I started doing it with scripture and with canon law. And
so you were stimulated.
I kind of had that whole thing all through, and it only bit me in canon law. The canon law prof kind of didn't like that method of operation. In fact, it wasn't canon law. He was teaching moral theology. He was a lawyer, but he was teaching moral theology, and he didn't like me deviating from the church position in the paper. So it was in a very interesting way of learning, by doing everything by paper writing, and in some instances having to defend your paper, because it was.
You must have had a sense of the, by definition, of the worldwide church.
Yes, very, very much so. And of course, being in Rome gave you that even more, because you had, you had the whole operation of the central focus point of the whole church, right there,
headquarters
in Rome. And during my time there was the time of the canonization of the 40 English martyrs, and I became quite involved in that, with doing auxiliary things, nothing to do with the canonization, although I went to the canonization, but I had stayed at the English college one summer. My first summer I stayed in Rome, and the American college was closed by that time, because the American students at North American College were coming home every summer. So I stayed at English college that summer. For people who don't know the system in Europe, university is where you go to study, college is where you live. So the college had a house up in the Alban Hills outside of town, across Lake Albano from the Pope's summer residence. So that's where I stayed my first summer, and got to know the kids at English college very well. So we served tea to all the English pilgrims, and of course the English boys had put out the word to all the pilgrims, coming, bring good tea with you. So they ended up with about 2 closets full of tea after it was over. But I think we were serving tea in 55-gallon wash tubs.
Oh my! And
I think we served about 12 or 14 a day for 15 or 16 days. So we served a little tea.
I never thought of you as an expert in serving tea, Frank.
Well, I don't know if you're an expert at serving it out of wash tubs. But for that number, you had to make it.
Do many priests who who were trained, originating from Vermont, have many of them gone to Rome for that education?
Well, we have a number that go to North American College over the years, and probably our diocese for a number of years had the most at the Beta, because Bishop Joyce got to know the rector of the Beta very well when he was in Rome for Vatican II. And there's 5 or 6 of us from Vermont who have gone to the Beta. One just 1 year behind me, Father John Feltz in Fairfax, was the last one of the diocese.
I know John.
To go to the Beta. Yes, that's right. He's done CPE at the hospital. Yes, yeah.
Well, I would think that would be a real wonderful kind of experience, and people from Vermont all of us we're thought of as the most rural state, or the next to the most rural state in the whole country, and that to become a priest, many people have gone to Rome. It kind of breaks the stereotype down of being.
Yes, and of course we've never had a major seminary in Vermont, so all of our priests have gone to
somewhere else,
Boston or Montreal or Ottawa or Emmitsburg, or someplace else, Baltimore. So we've never had our priests trained fully in Vermont.
Let me ask you a question that I've heard people ask before, or people wonder about. Sometimes when you go to seminary, it destroys your faith. I'm not talking about necessarily Roman Catholic seminary. I just mean any seminary, because the faith that you have gets somewhat taken apart and looked at and analyzed and discussed, and then you hear what others have as their faith and where that came from, and sometimes it can be a trying experience. Did you find that so?
Well, I think going in a little older probably helped me in that respect. I think the younger ones coming in right from high school probably suffer with that a lot more. And of course, a lot are more, in a sense, trying it out right after high school, where I'd had a number of years to think about. Even though I was trying it out when I first went to the seminary, I'd had a lot more years to think about trying it out. And of course, being a little older at the first seminary we went to, a couple of us were treated a little differently, because we were put in charge of certain things, and had certain things that turned out to be privileges. We were kind of restricted to grounds, but the 2 of us older ones got to go out quite often because we did the buying for the house and things like that. So we were in downtown Barre, Vermont, running around doing seminary errands. So
as you finished up your education at Rome, how did you look at your approaching ministry from that vantage point? My time in Rome also included a summer in England. Seeing I had all kinds of English connections at the Beta, instead of coming home to work in a parish back home, I said, well, I've never been to England. I speak the language there. I'll take advantage of knowing all these Englishmen and line myself up with a diaconal experience in an English parish. So you did that? So you were a deacon?
I served as a deacon in an English parish for 4 months.
No, I didn't know that.
Between my last 2 years in the seminary, where the priest who subsequently became a bishop, he had long before that been chaplain at Oxford for a number of years, and really had a very forward-looking idea of ministry. He came to the parish just before I did, as a matter of fact. And when I arrived there was already one deacon there and another one going to arrive, but the one who was already there, his name was Frank.
Oh my.
So the pastor says, well, he says, we can't go with this was from the altar when he was introducing me. He says, we can't go with the traditional things, Frank Jr. and Frank Sr., or Big Frank and Little Frank. He says, so we'll call Frank, who's already here, Frank, and we'll call Frank, who's just arriving, Frank the Yank.
Frank the Yank. Real sense of humor.
And that falls into place even more so when you realize that I was ordained as a deacon at St. Edmund's College Seminary in Ware, in the Westminster Diocese, on the 4th of July.
Oh my, what timing. Exquisite.
So it was We kidded about that an awful lot.
I bet.
So,
well, had you...
But as I say, his idea of ministry was very, very wide open. He came into the parish, and at that time, if you'd wanted, say, nuns to come into the parish, you probably would have still advertised for an order of nuns to come in, but he didn't. He advertised 16 ministries that he wanted done in the parish and said, any nun of any order that wants to come into any of these ministries, please apply. So we had 2 Sacred Heart nuns and 1 something. We had 4 altogether. 2 were Sacred Heart, I remember, because there were 2 of them. The other 2 were different orders. They all lived together, but they weren't one community.
Well, had you thought of staying in England?
Not really, no. I mean, I belonged to the Burlington diocese, and I planned on doing my ministry in the Burlington diocese.
So Bishop Joyce was the bishop here at that time?
Yes.
He didn't mind your becoming a deacon there? No.
Well, actually, I became a deacon for the Diocese of Burlington. I just haven't, that's where the ceremony took place. I could have been ordained deacon in Rome before I went to England, or in England when I got there. At that time, you had to be finished your next to the last year of seminary to be ordained deacon. So I had to do it either just after I finished the year or just after I arrived in England. So,
well, as you came back home, you might say, had you conceptualized at all, like, whether you wanted to do rural ministry or big city ministry or college ministry?
That starting off in Vermont, you'd have a variety. You start off as an assistant in one of our large cities. Of course, that's not a large city by American standards, but one of our large cities, and then you would be a pastor in a rural place, and maybe someday a pastor back in one of the bigger places. Of course, now the pastors in the bigger places are there alone. They don't have assistants because the number of priests is down so much. And I had never thought of any special ministries. I did think of going in the Navy as a chaplain at one time, but my father was ill for a number of years. In fact, in a nursing home for a number of years. And by the time he passed on, I really thought I was a little old for military service, especially Navy, where you have sea duty. And having been in the Navy, I probably wouldn't have gone in any other service other than the Navy. But so I was going to do my complete ministry in parish ministry, and then after I did service as a deacon in both Springfield and Montpelier. Then I stayed in Montpelier when I was ordained priest, then went back to Springfield as a priest. And then to Mallett's Bay as an assistant, then to Island Pond and Norton as pastor, and then to Bethel, where I had 5 churches with an assistant as pastor. And it was at Bethel that the bishop called one afternoon and asked me if I thought I would be interested in hospital ministry. I said, well, I've never thought of it. I said, I've always liked the hospital aspect of parish ministry. I never thought of going into hospital ministry, as a specific special ministry. He says, well, we need somebody right now, and personnel has suggested you, and I would like to ask you to. So I says, well, right off the top of my head, I says, I'm going to need a little time to think about this and pray about it. I mean, you come right out of the blue at me this afternoon. Yeah. He says, oh yeah. He says, give me a call back in a few days. So I prayed about it and talked with a few priests who know me well, and talked with family members. And everybody thought I would enjoy it and be good at it. So I called back and said I'd try it, and lined up to go to CPE at Holy Family Hospital in Methuen, Massachusetts, where I did all 4 of my units of CPE.
That was a whole year.
Yeah. And came back and went right into hospital ministry at then Medical Center Hospital of Vermont, which has since become Fletcher Allen Health Care. And of course we were taking care of Fanny Allen too, so we 2 priests kind of predated the merger. So, but as I say, this was something that came out of the blue at me, but I found the CPE very interesting, very much, a developmental thing for me. It's the type of thing which a lot of people think of it as a year of education, but it's not really a year of education. It's a year of education and really personal development is the way I've always described it. In fact, I've said it's primarily a time for personal development with some education thrown in.
Yeah, I would agree with you as a CPE supervisor. I think that's a very apt description.
So I enjoyed my CPE time very much, and I've enjoyed the ministry. It gets trying at times, of course, because you're dealing with crisis a lot, but you dealt with that, on a less frequent basis in the parish, and different types of crisis at different times. For instance, one of the structural crises that I dealt with in parish life was I was pastor in Highland Pond during the time that the Northeast Kingdom Community Church was very active there.
Yes, we heard a lot about that.
I was there during the famous raid. And so you had dealings with people who were being influenced by them. You had dealings with people trying to get away from them, who I helped a number of people get away from them. And you had dealings with people who were ready to go shoot them, and you had to say, no, that's not the right way to handle it. So a very broad aspect of ministry, and with just your general populace who, you had to tell, don't be influenced by their come on if they come to you, and they tended to go toward, recent widows or people who had another crisis in their family or something like that. So don't be influenced by them if they come to you at a time when you might seem vulnerable. But on the other hand, don't hate the individuals there, because most of them are weak-kneed people who are sucked into this, and they really don't need to be dumped on by everybody else.
No.
So you had to walk that middle line with dealing with the situation that they were there, and they did try to influence your people, and in fact they became very acceptable in Island Pond because to a great extent they were the only people you could get to do odd jobs and some professional work. Professionals in some small towns in Vermont do it when they need to do it, not when you need it done. Or when they need some money for groceries, they'll come and do your job.
That's right.
Whereas the cult was, if they said they'd come tomorrow and do something, they'd send somebody. It'd be somebody else who would come to collect the money another day later, but the work would get done the day they said it would be done. So they became more and more acceptable from points of view like that, but not necessarily religiously. But I did deal quite a bit with people, and even fairly young children, 12 and 13, getting away from them. So it was an exciting time as well as a tense time.
It sounds like at that time your understanding of your own personal ministry became broader and not
well, from that certain aspect of dealing
more interfaith,
dealing with the cult. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't interfaith in the sense of dealing with them on interfaith services or anything, but certainly interested in people getting away from them, whether they happen to be Catholic or not, if they came to me to get help getting away from them. Basically, it was helping people get back in contact with parents, and maybe giving them bus fare out of town, because you had to get them out of town. If you left them in town, they'd get their hooks back into them quickly and influence them to get back in. So the principal thing was to get them out of town. And with a couple of young children, working with families who were coming up to pick them up, and I would harbor them at the rectory while the family was coming to pick them up or something like that.
So your ministry was with the broader community there, not just with the parish and congregation.
Yeah. And then I went to Bethel from there, where, of course, as I said, I had 5 churches and all kinds of varying communities. As you know, the central mountains of Vermont were all the early settlements, so they're not heavily Catholic areas. In fact, my Protestant ancestors settled in a number of those high places, including Pomfret, which part of Pomfret came to my churches, although I don't know that they were officially in them, but they were the closest one to come to by road. So you had the aspect of dealing with a much larger community that wasn't Catholic, there. In fact, I belonged to Rotary in Bethel, and at the time I belonged, there was only one other Catholic besides myself in Rotary.
That's all?
I understand now there are a couple more Catholics in Rotary in Bethel, but at that time myself and one other were the only Catholics in Rotary. So those central mountains of Vermont are not heavily Catholic territory. And then we went from that aspect to summer people at Hawk Mountain in Rochester, to skiers at Killington, who are all part of my parish.
Killington was part of your parish?
Killington was one of my 5 churches, yeah. Now it's been disconnected from Bethel and put on with Chittenden. It was part of my 5-point charge when I was in Bethel. We didn't have a church there. We worshipped in the old Congregational church, which it was still a Congregational church. We shared expenses with them. And in fact, we had 2 churches in the 5-church complex that were not our buildings. We shared with Protestant communities that own the buildings. In fact, another interesting point on that, of my 5 churches in Bethel, only one was built as a Catholic church. 2 were Protestant churches that we worshipped in. One was a former Methodist church which we bought, and one was a house which was turned into a church.
That's interesting. Well, were some of the ones that were Protestant, did they have Protestant congregations meeting there too?
Oh yeah. The Congregational church in Killington still had a community, and the church in Pittsfield had already federated. They were Methodist and Congregational, and I think they had some Baptists too. And that was the only Protestant church in town by that time, and we just joined in using the building with them. So, and it really helped those communities survive too, because their congregations were getting so small they'd have a hard time supporting a building. So it was really an ecumenical move in those towns early.
Some of our viewers may not realize that in the Roman Catholic Church, you are ordained for a diocese, and the general expectation is that you're going to stay in that diocese for your whole ministry, whereas in some of the Protestant groups or the Episcopal groups, that might happen, but then again, if you were attracted to a parish in another state, another diocese, another conference, you might very well go there without feeling that you're deserting your your mother diocese or conference.
Yeah, the general setup in the Catholic Church is that you belong to a diocese or a religious order. Of course, religious order people go many places.
Sure.
But if you don't belong to a religious order, you belong to one specific diocese. Now, you can change dioceses, but it's something that's not done all that often. It's just the traditional way in the Catholic Church that you serve one diocese and remain with that diocese and be assigned anywhere in that diocese. The Diocese of Burlington covers the whole state of Vermont, as all the northern New England states. The diocese in each state covers the whole state. Massachusetts, Connecticut have more than one diocese, but Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are all individual dioceses.
So
with
if
one
we're going to make a generalization, the average Vermont priest wouldn't think of saying, I'd like to go down and be in the Diocese of Providence, Rhode Island.
No.
I wouldn't think of that.
No, although funny you mentioned Providence, our former chancellor was appointed Bishop of Providence.
Yes.
So you do get sent out of the diocese sometimes by promotion. And you can get sent out of the diocese for promotion that is not to Episcopal rank either. We've had two priests in the Holy Land in the last 25 years, one on the sort of giving end of things to the poor in those countries, Father Bill Corcoran, who's pastor in Heinsberg now, and Father Ed Foster, who was there for years ahead of him, but he was on the other end. He spent his time in New York raising money and in Jerusalem doling it out on the executive level rather than on the front line level. So we've had two priests serve the Near East missions. We of course have priests in the military. We've had a number of priests in South America over the years, and right now we don't have any left in South America, but we've still got 2 or 3 priests active in the diocese who did numbers of years in South America, basically with the St. James Society, which was started by Cardinal Cushing in Boston. Although we have Father Charlie Davignon at Holy Family in Essex with Mary Knoll for years. Mary Knoll is an association of diocesan priests. It's not an order as such that you...
Oh, I didn't realize that.
It's an association of diocesan priests.
Because my own background is I grew up in Ossining, New York, and Mary Knoll was
right there.
Was right there. It didn't have a separate address. I mean, post zip code or anything. It was part of Ossining, New York, right up on a knoll, a very high hill, really. Beautiful place.
So I mean, you can go outside the diocese for various reasons, but you still belong to the, like our military priests, when they retire, they come back to the diocese. Now that's in the process of flux right now, I understand. Because the military ordinariate is a diocese now. It never was a diocese until not too many years ago. So I don't know what the setup for priests retiring from military will be now that it's a diocese, but they always did come back to the diocese that they had been assigned from to the military. Some, of course, retired when they came back, even though they weren't the retirement age of priests in the diocese because they had military retirement. But
the average age to retire?
Well, right now,
70?
They ask us to stay on until 70. And canon law says we may retire at 70. If we want to stay on after 70 and are able to, we're certainly allowed to because the numbers are getting so low. There was a rule in this diocese, it's different in different dioceses, that you had to retire from a position of authority, either pastor or head of a diocesan office at 75, but I think that's kind of gone by the wayside now. Somebody's still vigorous enough at 75 to hold down a position of authority, they are allowed to do it. And I suspect things will be moving more in that direction.
Probably.
As time goes on, retirement may become a dream.
Well, it's a, you know, I don't mean this as a publicity or recruitment, but you want to say to our viewers a little bit about what ministry's been like for you as a priest?
I've very much enjoyed my ministry over the years, and it has been varied from the point of view that my assignments have been as assistants in larger parishes, pastor of smaller parishes, and much to my surprise, hospital ministry now for 6 years. And I fully expect when I get out of hospital ministry, I'll go right back into parish ministry. So it's going to be no surprise that that's what will happen. I would expect I'll be pastor of a mid-sized to larger parish at this time in my vocation life. That remains to be seen.
But I guess what I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think you're leading toward the vocation issue, and it's something that we certainly would like to see a lot of younger people really address seriously today. I think where we suffered most, a lot of people think we suffered because of the changes of Vatican II, and a lot of people thought that the Catholic Church was going to let priests get married. I think there's been a certain element of that, but I think we've suffered more just historically from the point of view that there is not the commitment to anything today that there was in past generations. I mean, how many people work for one company for 40 years today? It's just not done. You take the next advancement with the other company if it's better than the company you're at. And I think that whole loss of commitment, and of course the church still requires a commitment, not only a commitment to stay with a diocese, but a commitment to celibacy. So I think a lot of younger people don't look at the priesthood as a viable option for them. We're getting much more older vocations now, but that doesn't mean we don't need younger vocations. It's probably much harder for a younger person to look at the priesthood today and see it as something that might be attractive to them. But we've always thought that the vocation was a call from God anyway, so we hope that there are not too many out there who are rejecting a call from God just because it doesn't look attractive. But I can see where it is much harder for a younger person to and so with all the turmoil in the church today too, it's something you might not want to jump into.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's, but we've seen this in history. Again, I feel lucky on this issue. I've been an amateur historian most of my life, and I've seen the ups and downs in church history, that after almost every council things tend to go downhill for a little while, because if the church is tightened up, the liberals leave. If the church is loosened up, the conservatives leave. So, you know, it hasn't upset me the way it has some, I don't think, but certainly we would like to see young people still considering vocations. Of course, we've broadly widened what lay people do in the church, so there are many ministries that were only done by priests or nuns that are done by lay people now, but that doesn't mean we don't need priests, we don't need nuns, we don't need brothers. We most certainly do, and hope that young people will consider it. In fact, we find that vocations today are to the orders which are contemplative, mm-hmm. or to orders with specific ministries that are very public and not a lot of controversy. You know, some nuns like Mother Teresa's order, and I'm sure that's going to increase even more now.
I would think.
But I mean, she's had no problem. In fact, her novitiate for all of Europe was in the parish that I served as a deacon in England. Now she has probably more than one novitiate in most countries in Europe. So I mean, you can just see vocations to her order and her calling burgeoning. And this is happening in some other orders also, but we certainly need a broader range of vocations, to particularly the everyday work of priests and nuns and brothers, to keep the ministry of the church alive and well, even though lay people are doing much, much more, and they'll do much more as time goes on. Still, we need priests, we need brothers, we need sisters. So I would hope that young people will at least look.
And, correct me if I'm wrong, but when people sometimes who don't know much about the Roman Catholic Church, when they think of a priest, they think of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Those three are only for people who are in religious
as vows for people who are in a religious community. Yes.
Now, if you're a diocesan priest,
we're expected to live that type of a lifestyle, but they are not taking as vows. You take promises to the bishop, and a promise to be obedient to the bishop, and a promise to the diocese to be part of the diocese. But the vows are for religious. But as I say, the lifestyle is much to be expected and much to be urged, I think, by those in the priestly ministry. Because
if a rich uncle left you $500,000, would you have to give it up to the diocese?
No, you wouldn't have to as a diocesan priest, no.
Okay.
No, in fact, we do have priests who have had rather large inheritances and live quite well, but the general cross-section of priests don't, because their income doesn't lead them that way.
Yeah, well, as an Episcopal priest, when I got ordained, I had to promise obedience to the bishop, but the bishop only over my life hasn't usually called me on it. I mean, if I'm wanting to do something very different, I need to check with the bishop and say what the bishop thinks and what the bishop wants, and if I want to move to another diocese, I have to have the bishop's permission.
Yeah, I think we have a little more control by the bishop there than you do. For instance, if I wanted to become a CPE supervisor, I would certainly have to be released by my bishop for the time, for the number of units of preparation for it. I couldn't I couldn't just do it on my own, and today probably with the numbers, most bishops would not release somebody.
Yeah, let's say we need you.
That amount of time.
Yeah, we need you.
Whereas I think in the Episcopal Church and other churches, if you're going into a specialty like that, you're pretty much released because you want to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I think
in
that's
that
true.
sense, we belong a little more to the bishop than most churches belong to their bishops or supervisors or whatever they call there.
But you don't have to get permission from the bishop to go fishing or to take a vacation here or there.
Well, actually, we're supposed to let the Chancery Office know if we're going to be gone from our parish for more than 2 Sundays, I think.
Okay.
So.
But is that more for communication, or is that
Well, it's more for
permission?
communication, and the fact that most people who we might get to fill in for us today are retired priests, and if one of them becomes ill or something, it's the diocese that's going to have to scramble to find coverage. So they like to know where pastors are going to be gone.
Well, Frank, you really present a rich and varied kind of ministry that you have lived and still are living very much. And I've really appreciated your being on the program to share that.
Very glad you asked me, and very glad I could share.
I hope it's been enjoyable for you to talk about Father Frank Hunters, and we all like sometimes to talk about ourselves.
Except in CPE.
that was different.
That's an in-joke.
Yes. Yes. CPE is clinical pastoral education, and that's a discipline, educational practicum experience where you look at yourself and your ministry, and they're hard questions that are asked, and I think that's what
fair.
Father Frank is speaking to. So thank you for being here today.
Well, very good, Lee. Glad that I came.
And if I encourage our viewers, since this is not a live program and you can't phone in, I encourage you to write to the studio, and if you have any comments or thoughts they want to share with you, the studio can forward them to you or to me or whatever people would like. So, thank you, Frank.
Very good.
Appreciate it.
Greatly.